But the point is, again, that any God would be able, by definition, to do, or at least most versions of gods, would be able to create a complex universe. After all, they are creators. And so that says absolutely nothing about the existence of the Christian God in particular. So we'll get rid of that argument as well. Now, I grant to Dr. Craig that a possible first argument that he's been using to some extent and with some qualifications is the idea of the existence of objective moral values. Although, again, if I really wanted to be looking at nitpicking and looking at the details, this is still not an argument for the existence of the Christian God, because there's plenty of other religions who claim that their gods invented morality, and in some cases their morality is quite different from the Christian variety. Therefore, I don't see how that is a proof of the existence of the Christian God in particular. But since I want this debate to last more than 5 minutes, I'll actually address this point. This is a direct quote from Dr. Craig. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. The problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it. Yes, I agree that objective moral values exist, and I agree that we all know it deep down. The difference is that there's a distinction between objective values and universal moral values. And Dr. Craig seems to be talking about the two interchangeably, and I think that is a confusion of the two arguments. So let me present a first counter-argument. This is a false dichotomy. Essentially, what Dr. Craig is presenting is that he admits only two alternatives. Either there's a universal moral code, which is given to us by God, or anything goes, or there is only moral relativism. Well, this is definitely a false dichotomy, which in fact very few, if any, modern philosophers and ethicists fall for. There is a third option. In fact, there is a variety of third options. The third option is a family of options. And that is that there are objective but local truths. That is, there are some things that are objectively true, but they're only true under certain circumstances. For example, rape. He picked rape as an example for his argument. Rape in social animals is definitely wrong. It's objectively wrong. As Dr. Roos said, quoted by Dr. Craig, it is objectively wrong because it just is not a good idea for social animals to allow people or members of their species to go around raping, or for that matter killing, other members of the same social group. You would not have a society in that case. So there is some objectivity to that. It is definitely objective that it's a bad idea to do it. Now, there are animals, on the other hand, that use rape, for example, or what we would think of anthropomorphically as rape, as a way to gauge the strength of the male, and so the female actually battles with the male in order to determine if the male is good enough to inseminate her. Now, these things are pretty far from social animals like we conceive them, and they're certainly not in the primate group. They are, for example, water striders. Now, for water striders, probably everybody would agree that morality doesn't even make any sense. It doesn't really apply. So there are some things that are moral and are right and are correct, they're truth, within certain boundaries. In this case, the social and biological boundaries of primates, not just human beings. And then, however, the same thing or similar behaviors just don't even pose the question under different circumstances, which is what I wanted to say in the quote that Dr. Craig actually brought up from me. The other counter-argument is that this is simply a non sequitur. Morality can come about without a God, and it can evolve by natural selection, because it is beneficial. So to state that if there are objective truths, that has to imply that that's because they come from a God, it's simply not true. There are plenty of objective things that don't come from a supernatural being, and morality can be one of those. This can be demonstrated. This is not just simple talk. People have been working on these kind of problems for the last few decades. And, for example, there are very sophisticated mathematical models based on game theory that show that, in fact, certain moral rules or certain decisions made by social animals are or are not adaptive, and therefore they are objectively better than others. And some other are objectively bad. This is something you can actually work on right now. There is also evidence consistent with my idea that in fact there are local moral truths, and this is empirical evidence that is brought up by the study of other primates. For example, our closest relatives, the pygmy chimpanzee or bonobos. They present behaviors that are in several respects very similar to the behavior of human beings. They do have moral rules, or what we would interpret as moral rules. They punish certain individuals for doing certain kinds of things, and those are the same kinds of actions that we don't allow in our society. So not only it is morality, there are some aspects of morality, not all of it, that are objective for human beings, but in fact they are objective also for our cousins. The third counter-argument is that the Christian God, one could make the argument, is not really that moral, or it depends at least on what you mean by morality. Let me give you a couple of examples. It's easy to talk about morality in general, but if you actually go to the Bible and look up a few passages, you get scared about the kind of morality we're talking about. For example, with the Lord's approval, a slave may be beaten to death with no punishment for the perpetrator as long as the slave doesn't die too quickly. So slavery is okay, apparently, according to certain passages in the Bible. But I don't consider that moral. As a punishment, the Lord will cause, this is several different passages in the Bible, will cause people to eat the flesh of their own sons and daughters and fathers and friends. My gosh, this is something that nobody would today think of as a moral thing, even though we might think that there are good reasons to punish people. We certainly wouldn't subject them to eat the flesh of their own sons and daughters. I don't think that's a particularly moral behavior. For a few more examples. This is a direct quote from Luke 19:27. But as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me. So if you disagree with somebody's opinion, you can get slain on the spot. Now, you can argue, of course, this was God's opinion. How can you possibly disagree with that? But still, it's not particularly nice. I mean, we wouldn't enforce that kind of rule tonight, for example. If you disagree with me, you can go out from this room in safety. And that servant who knew his master's will but did not make ready or act according to his will shall receive a severe beating. Again, the examples go on and on forever. I can give you, well, not forever, but there are quite a few more, and I can provide anybody who wants to email me with direct quotes and a long list of examples. So one could question that particular aspect of it too. Now, Dr. Craig also brought up the historical facts concerning Jesus. And he says essentially that Jesus had an unprecedented sense of divine authority. He brought up the point about the empty tomb that we heard. Jesus appeared after his death. And the disciples believed so strongly that they were actually willing to die for their faith. Well, let's take each one of these briefly into account. I only have a few minutes, so I can't get into too much detail. But first of all, the first counter-argument is that, in fact, there have been a multiplicity of messiahs all over the history of the human world, both before and after Jesus, and in fact at the same time as Jesus. So why would you pick one over another? There is little original, in fact, in the Christian religion, and historians and scholars of comparative religion will tell you that. The stories of the virgin birth, for example, the sacrifice, the resurrection, are found in a lot of previous cultures. Including those that influenced Hebraism and therefore Christianity. For example, Egyptians, Babylonians, and some Greek myths. And these are pretty well documented. So Christians, like a lot of other religions before them, they just cut and paste, like you do in Windows, and put together new stories that are slight variation on previous ones. Also, the moral precepts of Christianity are found, in fact, in other religions or philosophies. There's nothing particularly original about that either. And if you want an example, just go and read some of Plato's dialogues. Right there's Socrates, or what some people think like Socrates looked like. And some passages in Socrates really do sound like Jesus talking to his disciples. The second argument was the empty tomb. Well, the problem with the empty tomb is that there are obvious explanations for these facts. I'm not really ready to acknowledge that these are facts. I think that these are speculations at best. Let's forget that we're talking about events, alleged events that occurred about 2,000 years ago, at which there were few witnesses, and about which it was written several years after the actual events. So I'm not sure that these were actually facts, but let's grant for a minute that they were. Well, there are much easier explanations for each one of those facts that Dr. Craig brought up. For example, it is interesting that at the time there was a practice of reburial of some criminals. Jesus was, of course, condemned by the Roman state as a criminal, and criminals were actually not even supposed to be buried if they were crucified. If they were, according to rabbinic law, they were buried in a common tomb. And so it's very possible that he was actually buried and then brought back to the final iteration. Or there are simply many documented cases in history of mass hysteria. These are documented throughout the ages, up to the 20th century, and I don't really see much of a reason to invoke the supernatural if we can have a reasonable explanation within natural parameters. So the resurrection, to put it as the skeptic David Hume would have put it in the 18th century, is an extraordinary claim. Where is the extraordinary evidence? This is a very important point. There's nothing wrong with making extraordinary claims, and in fact, some of these extraordinary claims eventually do turn out to be correct. I mean, a physicist who tells you that you are made mostly of nothing is making a pretty extraordinary claim. Somebody who tells you that this thing that looks and feels solid to me is actually made mostly of empty space, it's a pretty extraordinary claim. Fortunately for physicists, they back it up with powerful mathematical theories which are also powerful backed up by empirical demonstration. So I'm inclined to believe quantum mechanics when they tell me something about tables and physical bodies. But these kind of very extraordinary claims require a lot more evidence that Dr. Craig has been able to amass. There's also another counter-argument that I call the Elvis effect. There are far more people claiming that Elvis is alive and has resurrected and appears around in different places of the world than ever claim to have seen Jesus alive. Now, are we going to believe those people? And if not, you have to explain why not. It seems to me that on the surface, there's a lot more witnesses for that kind of event, or for example, for alien abductions or anything of the sort. In fact, Elvis actually does make miracles as well. This is a weeping Elvis miracle that you can find on the internet. You can purchase the picture, of course, as you like, and you can worship it. There is several religions, several cults about Elvis. Now, I'm being facetious here, but the question is, why would you not believe anything of this stuff unless you do believe that Elvis? How many people here believe that Elvis is alive? Not that many. Good, because otherwise my argument would be much less effective. Oh, we found one. Now, the strength of belief argument, I don't think that proves absolutely anything. In fact, for one thing, most other religions can count on similar strength of convictions. Okay, I mean, every member, well, maybe not every, but most members, most followers of most religions are actually characterized by very strong convictions, and in many cases, they're willing to die for it. We've seen examples in the 20th century, pretty recently, in the last few years. So does that make any kind of prediction about the fact that they were right? I mean, the people in the Heaven's Gate cult died because they thought that there was a UFO beyond the comet. Does anybody believe that they were right and they're now happily basking around the universe hopping on flying saucers? No, good. The Nazis believed very strongly and were willing to die by the hundreds of thousands to follow whatever, that nutcase of Hitler was actually telling them to do. So obviously, being willing to die for a cause says absolutely nothing, unfortunately, about the truth of that cause. Now, the last exhibit that Dr. Craig had was the immediate experience of God. And I'm sure that many people here have had that immediate experience. I thought I had the same experience when I was young. So I think what you're talking about, or what he's talking about. He says this isn't really an argument for God's existence, and in fact, it's not. Now notice that we're down to very few arguments now because of his 5 arguments. The first 2 don't apply to the Christian God. The third one doesn't really either. And the 5th one, by his own admission, is not an argument. And so the only argument so far that applies to the Christian God is the historical evidence of Jesus, which is not that strong. Or no stronger than the resurrection of Elvis, at least. Again, this is a quote of Dr. Craig. You can know God exists wholly apart from arguments simply by immediately experiencing Him. Absolutely, that's true. Problem is, the brain is a funny thing. There are all sorts of things that we think we know, and then in fact turn out to be wrong. So how do you know that you know? Or you feel that you know, that's true. But I felt in the past that I knew several things, and then it turned out that I was wrong. So how do you actually know that? Furthermore, we actually know quite a bit today about how the brain works, and it's a marvelous topic in itself. We should have a debate just on that, probably. There's your brain on the right, or a scheme of your brain. And the interesting thing is that some neurobiological research has actually shown